3 years ago, Naomi walked into that house as the Korean Mafia Boss's black wife and learned very quickly what that title actually meant. She was allowed to sleep in his bed. She was allowed to wear his last name. He was not allowed to matter. His men called her boss's wife, the way people say, the new furniture. Polite, distant, temporary. So she stopped trying to be seen. She cooked for herself in the back kitchen after midnight. Quiet meals. Quiet plate. Quiet life. Until the night the most dangerous men in his organization walked into that same kitchen, tasted what she had made, and without asking permission or waiting for his approval, looked her in the eye and called her something no one had ever called her before. Mama Betty. Korean Mafia Boss never knew his black wife could cook, until his men named her Mama Betty. And after that night, the woman they used to overlook became the only person in the house no one dared to disrespect. This is how it happened. Chapter 1 Foot. Naomi learned the rules of that house before she ever learned her husband's real smile. The mansion sat high in the hills outside Busan, all black stone and glass, the kind of place designed to intimidate rather than welcome. 12 bedrooms, 7 bathrooms, a security wing that never slept, and one kitchen the staff treated like restricted territory. She was the only black woman inside those walls. The men who worked for her husband, Kang Jun-ho, the man the underworld simply called boss, never used her name unless they had no choice. They called her Madam when they were being polite and the wife when they thought she couldn't hear. Their eyes moved past her the same way they moved past the expensive art on the walls. Present. Don't. Irrelevant. 3 years earlier, on the night she first arrived, Junho's mother had looked her up and down in the foyer and spoken the sentence Naomi still carried like a bruise beneath her skin. She will never be the heart of this house. A black woman can warm a bed. She cannot hold a family. Junho had not corrected her. He had only said quiet and final, "She is my wife. That is enough." That was the last time anyone in the household spoke about what Naomi was supposed to become. So she became nothing. She woke before the sun and walked the long east corridor in silence. She drank her coffee alone on the balcony that overlooked the sea, the same balcony the men used for late-night cigarette breaks. When they found her there, they would nod once and leave. Never a conversation. Never a question about whether she had slept. Her days were measured in small, careful absences. She did not enter the main kitchen during staff hours. The head chef, a severe man named Park, made it clear with one look that the domain belonged to him. Naomi learned to wait until after midnight, when the last of the night shift had gone to their rooms and the only sound left was the low hum of the industrial refrigerators. That was when she cooked. Not for anyone else. Never for anyone else. She cooked for the version of herself that still remembered the smell of her grandmother's kitchen in Atlanta. Smoked paprika, slow-cooked collards, cornbread that cracked open like a secret. She cooked the dishes no one in this house had ever asked for and no one would ever taste. Red beans that simmered for 6 hours. Fried chicken seasoned with a mix she had carried from home in a small tin. Peach cobbler she ate alone, standing at the counter, the spoon still warm from the oven. He plated nothing for two. She never left leftovers in the open. Every morning she cleaned every trace of her presence so thoroughly that even Park, who noticed everything, found nothing. Junho himself barely registered the difference between her presence and her absence. He left before dawn most days and returned long after the house had gone quiet. When he came to their bedroom, he would stand at the window for a long time, looking out at the water as if the sea might give him answers the marriage could not. Sometimes he said her name. Sometimes he did not. He never asked what she had eaten. He never asked if she was lonely. He never walked into the back kitchen after midnight. The men who guarded him treated her with the same careful distance. They opened doors. They carried packages. They answered when she spoke. But they never lingered. One of them, a tall enforcer named Minyo with a scar that cut through his left eyebrow, had once made the mistake of asking if she needed anything from the market. The question hung in the air for 3 full seconds before he realized no one else in the room was breathing. After that, no one asked again. Naomi told herself it was better this way. If no one expected anything from her, then no one could be disappointed when she remained exactly what they had decided she was. The black wife who occupied a title and a bed and nothing more. She had stopped hoping to be seen. She had stopped hoping to be needed. She had stopped hoping that one day someone in that cold, perfect house would taste something she made and understand that she was more than the quiet woman who walked the East Corridor alone. 3 years of silence. 3 years of cooking after midnight for an audience of one. 3 years of carrying her mother-in-law's words like a second pulse under her ribs. She will never be the heart of this house. Naomi believed them. Until the night everything changed. Chapter 2 Foot. The night it began did not feel special at first. It was a Thursday in late October, the kind of cold that settled into the stone floors and refused to leave. Rain had been falling since early afternoon, steady and heavy, turning the long driveway into a dark mirror. Most of the household staff had already retreated to their quarters. The security team remained on rotation, their presence marked only by the occasional soft crackle of radios and the muted sound of boots on wet pavement outside. Junho had left the house just after 9. There had been no explanation. There rarely was. He simply appeared in the doorway of the study where Naomi sat reading, buttoned his black coat and said, "I'll be late." Then he was gone, the heavy front door closing behind him with a finality that always felt larger than the sound itself. Naomi waited until the last of the night staff had passed her door before she rose. She moved through the East Corridor the way she always did after midnight, barefoot, quiet, careful not to let the old floorboards announce her. The main kitchen lights were off. Park had left hours earlier, the stainless steel counters wiped to a sterile shine, every pot and pan returned to its exact place. The only light came from the small under-cabinet strip above the secondary prep area at the far end, the one the staff rarely used. Naomi turned it on. She moved with the ease of long practice. From the back of the lower cabinet she retrieved the small tin she kept hidden behind the industrial containers of rice. Inside was the seasoning mix she had brought from Atlanta 3 years earlier. A blend of smoked paprika, garlic powder, onion powder, cayenne and a touch of brown sugar her grandmother had taught her to measure by eye. The smell rose the moment she opened it, warm and familiar, a private country she carried inside a house that had never asked to visit. Tonight she decided on something simple. Chicken thighs, bone-in, skin still on. She patted them dry with paper towels, then worked the seasoning into every surface with her fingers, pressing it under the skin where the flavor would settle deepest. A cast-iron skillet she had quietly claimed months ago waited on the back burner. She set it over medium heat, added a thin layer of oil, and listened to the quiet sizzle as the first pieces met the metal. The smell began to move through the kitchen almost immediately. It was not the clean, restrained scent of the meals Park prepared for the household. This was richer, slower, the kind of aroma that clung to clothes and hair and memory. Garlic and smoke. The faint sweetness of the brown sugar caramelizing against the skin. The deep, savory note of chicken fat rendering down. Naomi did not notice the first soft footsteps in the hallway. She was turning the pieces when the kitchen door opened. Mincio stood there. He was still in the black tactical jacket he wore on night duty, rain darkening the shoulders. The scar that cut through his left eyebrow looked sharper under the low light. For a long moment he said nothing. His eyes moved from her face to the skillet, then back again as if he needed time to reconcile the two things he was seeing. Naomi's hands stilled. In 3 years, no one had ever walked into this kitchen while she was cooking. Minnes's voice when it came was low and careful. That smell. He did not finish the sentence. Behind him, another set of footsteps approached. Then another. Within less than a minute, 3 more of Junho's men stood in the doorway, all of them still damp from the rain, all of them staring at the skillet as though it had no right to exist in this house. No one spoke. The only sound was the steady crackle of the chicken in the pan and the soft rain against the windows. Naomi felt the old instinct rise, the urge to turn off the burner, to apologize, to erase every trace of herself before the moment could become something that required explanation. She had lived by that instinct for 3 years. It had kept her safe. It had kept her invisible. But the smell was already in the air. And for the first time someone other than her was breathing it in. Minho took one step farther into the kitchen. His eyes never left the food. "Madam," he said, the title still formal, still careful. "What is that?" Naomi looked down at the skillet, then back at the 4 men standing in the doorway of a kitchen that had never belonged to her. She could have lied. She could have said it was nothing. Instead she answered the only way that felt true. "It's just chicken." The words came out quieter than she intended. One of the younger men, a quiet one they called Han, inhaled slowly as if the air itself had weight. No one moved to leave. No one reached for a radio to report the unusual activity in the back kitchen. They simply stood there, rain still dripping from their jackets, watching a black woman cook food that did not belong to this house. And for the first time in 3 years, Naomi felt the silence around her shift. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. Chapter 3 Foot. Naomi turned back to the skillet because looking at them felt more dangerous than the heat under her hands. She moved the chicken pieces with a pair of tongs, listening to the skin crackle and deepen in color. The smell had grown thicker now, filling the wide kitchen, clinging to the cool air that came in through the half-open window above the sink. She could feel the men's attention the way a person feels a change in weather. Not loud but impossible to ignore. Minicio remained the closest. He had not taken another step, yet something in his posture had altered. The rigid readiness he carried on duty had loosened by a fraction. His eyes kept returning to the pan, then to her hands, as if he were trying to understand how the same kitchen that produced Park's precise, almost clinical meals could suddenly smell like this. Behind him, Han stood with his arms crossed, but the stance looked more like self-protection than authority. The other two men, one broad-shouldered and silent, the other younger with a faded tattoo visible at his wrist, stayed near the doorway, rain still darkening the hems of their pants. No one reached for a phone. No one suggested they should leave. Naomi plated the first piece onto a small white dish she kept for herself. The skin was a deep mahogany, glistening, the seasoning visible in the tiny charred edges. She had not planned to offer it. Offering meant inviting judgment. Offering meant risking the quiet she had protected for 3 years. Yet the plate remained in her hand. Minicio's voice came again, lower this time. "Pay I?" The question was simple. It should not have carried weight. But in that kitchen, under that low light, with 4 of her husband's most trusted men watching, it felt like the first real door anyone had opened toward her since the night she arrived. Naomi gave a single nod. She did not trust her voice. Minicio took the plate with both hands, the way a person accepts something fragile. He did not eat immediately. He studied the chicken as though it might explain itself. Then he tore a small piece free with his fingers, the way men who have lived rough often do, and placed it in his mouth. The silence that followed was different from every silence Naomi had known in that house. Minicio's eyes closed for half a second. When they opened, something unguarded had settled in them. He chewed slowly, deliberately, then looked at her as if seeing her for the first time in 3 years. "This," he said almost under his breath, "is not ordinary food." Han stepped forward without waiting for permission. Naomi prepared a second small plate. Then a third. Then a fourth. She moved on instinct now, portioning the remaining pieces, watching as each man accepted the food with the same careful hands. No one spoke while they ate. The only sounds were the soft rain and the quiet scrape of fingers against ceramic. When the last piece was gone, Han wiped his thumb along the edge of his plate, catching a final streak of seasoning, and shook his head once. "My mother used to cook like this," he said. The words seemed to surprise even him. Not the same dishes, but the same feeling. Like the food knew you were tired. The broad-shouldered man, who had not spoken a word since entering, finally cleared his throat. "Boss never mentioned you could cook." Naomi felt the old armor rise in her chest. "He doesn't know," she answered. The admission left her mouth before she could stop it. 4 pairs of eyes lifted to her face. Minyo studied her for a long moment. Rain still beaded along the scar above his eyebrow. When he spoke again, his voice carried none of the distance the household usually placed between themselves and the boss's wife. "Then he's been missing something important." The words landed softly, yet they struck deeper than any formal compliment could have. Naomi turned toward the sink, needing the small task of washing her hands, needing a reason not to meet their eyes. She had spent 3 years preparing for indifference. She had no practice receiving this quiet collective recognition that asked for nothing in return. Behind her she heard the soft shift of boots on tile. Han's voice came next, hesitant but clear. "Is there more?" Naomi looked over her shoulder. The skillet still held the last of the rendered fat and a few caramelized bits of seasoning. She could have said no. She could have cleaned everything and sent them away and returned to the safety of being unseen. Instead she reached for the bowl of rice she had steamed earlier for herself, the one she usually ate alone standing at the counter. She divided it among 4 small bowls, spooned the remaining pan drippings over each portion and held them out. The men accepted the bowls without ceremony. They ate standing up the way people eat when they are genuinely hungry and the food is good enough to silence every other thought. No one checked the time. No one glanced toward the hallway to see if the boss had returned. For a brief stretch of minutes, the hierarchy of the house loosened, and something simpler took its place. When the bowls were empty, Minho set his down on the counter with quiet care. He looked at Naomi directly. "Thank you," he said. Then, after a pause that felt deliberate, he added 2 words that had never been spoken to her inside these walls. "Mama Betty." The name hung in the air between them. Han repeated it first, almost experimentally, as if testing the shape of it. Then the others followed, low and respectful, the way men in their world offered a title that mattered. "Mama Betty." Naomi stood very still, the dish towel still in her hands, and felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in 3 years. She had been seen. Not as the boss's black wife. Not as a silent presence in the East Corridor. But as the woman who had fed them when they were tired and wet and far from whatever homes they had once known. Outside, the rain continued its steady fall. Somewhere in the city, Kang Junho was still handling whatever business had called him away. But inside the back kitchen of the house that had never made room for her, 4 of his most dangerous men had already decided she belonged. And none of them intended to keep that decision a secret. Chapter 4. Morning arrived the way it always did in that house. Gray light sliding across the black stone floors, the distant sound of security radios, the low mechanical hum of a place that never truly slept. Naomi woke before the alarm she no longer needed. For a long moment she lay still, staring at the ceiling, replaying the previous night in fragments. The rain. The skillet. The way Minacio's eyes had closed when he tasted the chicken. The name that had left his mouth as if it had always belonged to her. Mama Betty. She had not corrected him. She had not told them to stop. And that, more than the food itself, was what kept her awake long after the men had finally left the kitchen and returned to their posts. She rose and moved through her usual routine with extra care, as if ordinary motions could restore the distance she had lost. She showered. She dressed in the simple dark clothes she preferred. She walked the east corridor toward the small balcony where she took her coffee, expecting the same empty quiet that had defined her mornings for 3 years. It was not empty. Minacio was already there. He stood near the railing, a paper cup of coffee in one hand, the scar above his eyebrow catching the early light. When he saw her, he did not look surprised. He simply stepped aside, making space at the railing as though they had shared this view 100 times. "Morning, Mama Betty," he said. The title was quieter in daylight but no less certain. Naomi stopped 2 paces away. The old instinct rose immediately, the urge to remind him of her actual name, to reassert the formal boundary the house had always maintained. Yet the words stayed behind her teeth. Something in his tone made correction feel unnecessary, almost unkind. She nodded once and took her place at the railing. They drank in silence for a while. Below them, the sea moved in slow gray folds. A security vehicle rolled along the lower driveway and disappeared behind the trees. Minho spoke first. "The others are asking if you'll cook again tonight." Naomi kept her eyes on the water. "I only cook for myself." "I know." He turned the cup slowly in his hands. "That's why they're asking." She had no answer for that. Later that morning, the shift became impossible to ignore. When Naomi walked into the main hallway, Hans straightened and gave her a small, respectful nod he had never offered before. The broad-shouldered man who had eaten in silence the night before appeared from the security office carrying a bag of fresh produce. Collard greens, sweet potatoes, a whole chicken, and set it on the side table near the back kitchen without a word. He only met her eyes briefly, then returned the way he came. Park, the head chef, noticed. Naomi saw it in the way his gaze followed the bag, then flicked toward her with a tightness around the mouth. He said nothing. He simply returned to his prep list with sharper movements than usual, the blade of his knife striking the cutting board a little too hard. By midday, 2 more of Junho's men had found reasons to pass through the east corridor while she was there. Neither spoke at length. They only offered the same quiet greeting Minho had used on the balcony. "Mama Betty." Each time the name reached her, Naomi felt the same strange pressure behind her ribs, part warmth, part alarm. She had spent 3 years learning how to disappear inside this house. Being seen required a different kind of strength, and she was not certain she possessed it. Junho returned in the late afternoon. Naomi heard the front door, the low exchange of voices with the security team, the measured footsteps that always announced him before he appeared. She remained in the small sitting room off the east corridor, a book open in her lap that she had not turned a page of in 20 minutes. He paused in the doorway when he saw her. For a moment the familiar distance settled between them again, the careful space of a marriage that functioned without truly touching. Then his eyes moved over her face with slightly more attention than usual, as if something in the air of the house had already reached him. "You're quiet today," he said. Naomi closed the book. "I'm always quiet." A faint crease appeared between his brows. He looked as though he might ask another question, then decided against it. He only nodded once and continued toward the study, the door closing softly behind him. Naomi sat very still after he left. He did not know yet. The men had not told him. The name Mama Betty still belonged only to the rain-soaked kitchen and the 4 men who had stood in it. But secrets inside a house like this never remained secrets for long. Someone would speak. Someone would mention the smell that had drifted through the hallway, or the way the night shift guards had lingered near the back kitchen, or the bag of collard greens that had appeared without a purchase order. Naomi looked down at her hands. They still carried the faint memory of seasoning and heat. She had fed them once. She had allowed them to call her something that felt dangerously close to belonging. And now the house itself seemed to be waiting to see what she would do next. Outside, the October light began to fade. Somewhere in the security wing, she knew the same question was already circulating among the men who had tasted her food. Would Mama Betty cook again tonight? Naomi did not yet know the answer. But for the first time in 3 years, the thought of being needed did not feel like a threat. It felt like a door she was no longer certain she wanted to keep closed. Chapter 5. Night settled over the house with the same heavy quiet as the night before, but nothing inside the walls felt the same. Naomi stood in the back kitchen long after the staff had gone, the small under-cabinet light casting its narrow glow across the counter. The bag of produce the broad-shouldered man had left that morning sat open beside her. Collard greens rinsed and waiting. Sweet potatoes. A whole chicken larger than the one she had cooked the previous night. Someone had also added a small paper sack of smoked paprika and a jar of honey, items that had never appeared on Park's inventory lists. She had not asked for any of it. Yet here it was. Naomi rested both hands on the edge of the counter and closed her eyes. The sensible choice was still available. She could put everything away, turn off the light, and return to the east corridor as if the previous night had been a single contained accident. The men would eventually stop asking. The name Mama Betty would fade. The house would settle back into the silence she understood. She opened her eyes and reached for the chicken. The decision did not feel dramatic. It simply felt honest. She worked the way she always had, slowly, with full attention, the way her grandmother had taught her. Seasoning under the skin. A steady hand with the salt. The collards cleaned leaf by leaf, stems removed, left to soak in cold water while the chicken found its place in the cast-iron skillet. The sweet potatoes went into the oven whole, their skins rubbed with oil so they would soften from the inside out. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was performed for an audience. But an audience arrived anyway. Minu came first, as she had somehow known he would. He entered without knocking, rain still fresh on the shoulders of his jacket, and stopped just inside the doorway. Behind him, Han appeared, then 2 others she recognized from the night shift, then 3 more she had only ever seen at a distance. By the time the chicken skin had turned deep gold and the collards were simmering with garlic and a touch of smoked meat, 9 men stood in or near the kitchen. No one spoke at first. They simply watched her move. Naomi felt their attention like a low current under her skin. She kept her focus on the food, but she no longer tried to make herself smaller. When the chicken was ready, she transferred it to a large wooden board she had never used for anyone but herself. She sliced the sweet potatoes open so the soft flesh steamed upward. She tasted the collards once, adjusted the seasoning, and then stepped back. Minu was the one who finally broke the silence. "Mama Betty," he said, the name steady now, no longer experimental. "Will you let us eat?" She met his eyes. Yes. Plates appeared from a cabinet the men clearly knew better than she did. They formed a loose line without being told, the hierarchy of the organization temporarily set aside for something older and simpler. Naomi served them herself. She placed food on each plate with the same care she had once reserved only for her own solitary meals. No one reached or grabbed. They waited. They thanked her in low voices. They carried their plates a few steps away and ate standing the way they had the night before. The sounds that filled the kitchen were quiet ones. The soft clink of forks, the low murmur of men who were genuinely hungry, the occasional soft exhale of satisfaction. Han closed his eyes on the first bite of collards and shook his head as if something long missing had returned. One of the older men, a quiet enforcer named Seo-jun who rarely spoke in her presence, looked up after tasting the chicken and said only, "This is the real thing." Naomi stood near the stove, a clean towel in her hands, and let herself watch them. For 3 years she had cooked in this kitchen as a ghost. Tonight the same space held living voices and the warm, complicated smell of food that had been made to be shared. She felt the weight of her mother-in-law's old sentence rise again. She will never be the heart of this house. And for the first time the words did not sit quite as heavily as they once had. Min-seo finished first. He set his empty plate on the counter, wiped his hands, and looked at her with a seriousness that cut through the casual atmosphere. "Boss doesn't know what he's been walking past," he said. Several of the others made small sounds of agreement. Naomi's voice came out quieter than she expected. "He has more important things to see." Min-seo shook his head once. "No. He doesn't." The simplicity of the contradiction left her without a ready answer. Before either of them could say more, a new set of footsteps approached from the main hallway. The men straightened almost instinctively. The easy atmosphere in the kitchen tightened by a fraction. Park stood in the doorway. The head chef's eyes moved across the scene. The empty plates, the open bags of ingredients that did not belong to his inventory, the 9 men of Kang Junho's organization standing in a kitchen that was supposed to be under his control, and Naomi at the center of it all. His face remained carefully neutral, but something cold and assessing settled behind his eyes. He looked at Naomi for a long moment. Then he looked at the food that remained on the board. Without a word he turned and walked away. The men watched him go. No one spoke until the sound of his footsteps had completely faded. Han was the first to break the new silence. "He'll tell the boss." Min-seo's jaw shifted slightly. "Maybe." Naomi felt the old fear return, sharp and familiar. Being seen by the men was one kind of risk. Being reported to her husband was another. Junho had never forbidden her from cooking. He had simply never noticed. Once he knew, once the quiet, private thing she had protected became information that moved through the house, everything would change in ways she could not yet predict. She looked down at her hands. They still smelled of garlic and smoked paprika and the deep heat of the skillet. Around her, the men began to clean without being asked. Plates were rinsed. The wooden board was wiped. Someone covered the remaining collards and set them carefully in the refrigerator. The kitchen returned to order with a speed and efficiency that felt almost protective. When the last of them finally prepared to leave, Min-seo paused at the door. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked. Naomi hesitated only a second. "Yes." He nodded once as if a quiet agreement had just been sealed and followed the others into the hallway. Naomi remained alone in the kitchen after they had gone. The under-cabinet light still glowed. The air still carried the rich, lingering smell of the meal. Somewhere in the house, Park was deciding what he would say. Somewhere in the city or in the study, Kang Junho continued living the life that had never made room for the woman who cooked after midnight. But the men had already made their decision. And Naomi, standing in the quiet with the evidence of their respect still warm in the air, realized she had begun to make one of her own. She was no longer cooking only for herself. And she was no longer certain she wanted to go back. Quick pause. I need to step out of Naomi and Junho's story for a moment. If you've been listening and feeling that slow pull, wishing the tension would go further than YouTube allows, I made something for you. It's called His Secret. An Afro-Korean romance that doesn't stop where this platform forces me to stop. It goes all the way into the private hours, the ones we can't show here. Chapter 1 is completely free on Sealer. No payment needed. Just press play. The link is in the channel dashboard. Go listen if you've been wanting more. When you're done, come straight back. Because right now we return to the house in Busan. Chapter 6 begins now. Chapter 6. Junho learned the name before he learned the reason. It reached him in the late morning, delivered without ceremony by Park in the doorway of the study. The head chef stood with his hands clasped behind his back, posture perfect, voice carefully even. There has been activity in the secondary kitchen after midnight, Park said. Your wife has been preparing food. Several of the men have been present. They are calling her something new. Junho looked up from the papers on his desk. What are they calling her? Park hesitated only a fraction of a second. Mama Betty. The two words hung in the quiet study. Junho leaned back in his chair. Outside the wide window the sea moved under a pale sky, indifferent and constant. He repeated the name once under his breath, testing the shape of it. It did not belong to the formal language of the household. It did not sound like a title given out of duty. It sounded like something the men had chosen. How long? He asked. 2 nights, Park answered. Possibly longer. The men are protective of it. Junho dismissed him with a short nod. After the door closed he remained still for a long time. He tried to remember the last occasion he had seen Naomi in the kitchen. He could not. He tried to remember the last time he had asked what she ate, or whether she was comfortable, or whether the house had made any room for her beyond the title of wife. The answers did not come easily. He had told himself for 3 years that distance was safer. He had told himself that a woman brought into this life needed protection more than attention. He had not considered that the absence of attention could become its own kind of harm. That night he did not leave the house. He waited until the main floor had gone quiet and the security rotation had settled into its usual pattern. Then he walked the east corridor in silence, past the rooms that had never held voices, past the long windows that looked down toward the water. Light glowed faintly under the door of the back kitchen. He opened it without knocking. Naomi stood at the stove, her back to him. The air was thick with the smell of garlic, smoked meat and something sweet baking in the oven. 7 of his men were already present, plates in hand or waiting near the counter. Minyo noticed him first. The shift in the room was immediate and visible. Spines straightening, conversations stopping mid-sentence, the easy atmosphere of the previous nights pulling tight like a wire. Naomi turned. For a moment the only sound was the low simmer of whatever she had in the pot. Junho's eyes moved from her face to the food, then to the men who had gathered around her cooking without his knowledge. He saw the way they looked at her, not with the careful formality they used in his presence, but with a respect that had nothing to do with his authority. Minyo spoke carefully. Boss. Junho lifted a hand, a small gesture that kept the others in place. He walked farther into the kitchen, stopping a few feet from the stove. Naomi held a wooden spoon in one hand. She did not step back. She did not apologize. The 3 years of silence between them seemed to gather in the space around their feet. You're cooking, he said. It was not a question. Yes. For them. Naomi glanced once at the men, then back at her husband. For anyone who is hungry. Something moved across Junho's face too quickly to name. He looked at the large pot, at the cast-iron skillet, at the covered dish warming on the back of the stove. The smells were unfamiliar in this house. They did not belong to Park's precise, restrained meals. They belonged to a different history entirely. Mincio cleared his throat. Boss. You should taste it. The suggestion carried a quiet weight. Several of the other men nodded almost imperceptibly. Naomi said nothing. She simply reached for a clean plate, spooned a portion of the collards and a piece of the chicken she had prepared and held it out to him. Their fingers did not touch when he took it. Junho looked down at the food. He had eaten in some of the most expensive rooms in the city. He had been served by private chefs and restaurant kitchens that operated on reputation alone. None of those meals had ever been placed in his hands like this, simply without performance by the woman who had lived in his house for 3 years without ever being truly seen. He took a bite. The kitchen remained completely still. The flavor was deep and unapologetic. Smoke and salt and careful heat. The kind of food that did not try to impress, only to satisfy. He chewed slowly, then took another bite, then another. When he finally set the plate down, the men were still watching him with an attention that felt almost protective of Naomi rather than of him. Junho met his wife's eyes. How long have you been doing this? 3 years, she answered. At night. After everyone else was gone. The honesty in her voice landed harder than any accusation could have. He looked around the kitchen again, at the men who had named her Mama Betty, at the food that had drawn them here, at the woman he had married and then allowed to become invisible. The distance he had maintained suddenly felt less like protection and more like a failure he had never bothered to examine. "I didn't know," he said. Naomi held his gaze. "I know." The two words contained no bitterness, only the quiet fact of it. Around them the men remained silent. No one attempted to explain or defend what had grown in this kitchen over the past 2 nights. They simply stood as witnesses to the moment their boss finally understood what they had already decided. Junho exhaled once, slowly. Then he looked at Naomi again and spoke in a voice the household had rarely heard from him. Lower, stripped of the authority he wore like armor. "Will you make enough for one more?" Naomi studied his face for a long moment. Something in her expression shifted. Not soft, not yielding, but open in a way it had not been in 3 years. "Yes," she said. She turned back to the stove, and for the first time since she had entered this house, her husband remained in the kitchen and waited to be fed. Chapter 7. The men understood before anyone spoke. One by one they finished what remained on their plates, rinsed them in silence and left the kitchen with a quiet discipline that felt almost ceremonial. Minso was the last to go. He paused at the doorway, glanced once at Junho, then at Naomi, and gave a small nod that carried more meaning than any report he had ever delivered. Then he too disappeared into the hallway, pulling the door softly closed behind him. The kitchen became still. Only the low simmer of the pot and the quiet tick of cooling metal remained. Junho stood near the counter, the empty plate still in his hand. He set it down carefully, as if the smallest noise might break whatever fragile thing had entered the room with him. Naomi turned off the burner. The sudden absence of the flame made the silence feel larger. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Junho's eyes moved over the space the way a man surveys ground he has walked past for years without ever truly seeing. The cast iron skillet. The wooden board. The small tin of seasoning that still sat open near the stove. The evidence of a life that had been happening in his house every night while he slept 2 corridors away. 3 years, he said finally. His voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. "You did this for 3 years and I never knew." Naomi wiped her hands on the towel, buying herself a few seconds. "You weren't meant to know." "Why?" The question was simple. The answer was not. She looked at him directly. "Because this house never asked me for anything except to be quiet and present. So I gave it exactly that." Junho absorbed the words without defense. He did not rush to explain himself. He did not offer the usual justifications about protection or the demands of his world. He simply stood there and let the truth settle between them. After a while he said, "My mother told you that you would never be the heart of this house." Naomi's hands stilled. She had not expected him to remember the exact sentence. She had not expected him to speak it aloud. "I heard her," he continued. "I heard every word. And I said nothing." The admission landed heavier than any apology could have. Naomi felt the old bruise of those words pulse once under her ribs. She had carried them so long they had become part of her posture, part of the way she moved through these rooms. Hearing them in his voice now did not erase them. But it changed their shape. "I believed her," she said. Junho nodded once, slowly. "I understand." He stepped closer to the stove, close enough that she could smell the faint trace of night air still clinging to his shirt. He looked down at the remaining food, then back at her face. "The men call you Mama Betty." "Yes." "They chose that name themselves." "Yes." Something almost like wonder moved across his expression, quickly controlled. "In all the years I have run this organization, I have never seen them offer a name like that to anyone. Not even to me." Naomi said nothing. Junho rested one hand on the counter, the same counter she had cleaned in secret for 3 years. "I kept you at a distance because I thought it would keep you safe," he said. "I told myself that if you remained separate from this life, it could not touch you. I did not consider that the distance itself might be the thing that harmed you." The honesty in his voice was stripped of performance. It did not ask for immediate forgiveness. It simply placed the truth on the table between them. Naomi felt something shift inside her chest. Not dramatic, not sudden, but real. The careful walls she had maintained for 3 years did not collapse. They simply loosened by a fraction, enough to let a different kind of air in. "I don't need grand gestures," she said. "I never did. I only needed to know I was not invisible in my own home." Junho held her gaze. "You are not invisible." The 4 words were spoken with the same quiet finality he used when he gave orders that could not be questioned. But this time the order was directed at himself as much as at her. Outside, the night wind moved against the windows. Somewhere in the security wing, the men who had named her would already be carrying the news of this moment in their silence. Park would learn of it soon enough. The household would begin to adjust around a new center of gravity. But none of that mattered yet. What mattered was the man standing in the kitchen he had ignored for 3 years, looking at the woman he had married and only now beginning to see. Junho glanced once more at the food that remained. "Will you sit with me?" he asked. "Not as the boss's wife. Just with me." Naomi studied his face. The same man who had once told his mother that her presence was enough, now stood asking for something far simpler and far more difficult. She nodded once. They sat at the small prep table the staff never used for meals. Junho brought 2 clean plates. Naomi portioned what was left of the chicken and collards. They ate in silence at first, the way people do when words still feel too large for the space. The food was no longer hot, but neither of them commented on it. When they finished, Junho did not rise immediately. He looked at her across the narrow table and spoke the sentence she had waited 3 years to hear, even if she had never allowed herself to hope for it. "This house is different with you in it," he said. "I was just too blind to notice." Naomi felt the old cruel words, "She will never be the heart of this house," rise one final time. And for the first time she did not believe them. Chapter 8. The change did not arrive with announcements or orders. It arrived in the way the house began to breathe differently. By the following morning, every man on the night rotation already knew that the boss had stayed in the back kitchen and eaten what Mama Betty cooked. No one needed to be told what it meant. In their world, presence was a language. Junho had chosen to remain. That single choice rearranged the invisible hierarchy of the household more effectively than any spoken command. Naomi felt it first in the small things. When she walked the east corridor after sunrise, the security staff no longer offered the distant, polite nods of the past 3 years. They met her eyes. Minzio, coming off duty, stopped and asked if she needed anything from the morning market run. Han appeared later with a fresh bag of ingredients, not left anonymously on a side table this time, but carried directly to her and placed in her hands with a short, respectful, "For later, Mama Betty." Park's kitchen remained formally his domain during daylight hours, but the temperature around him had changed. He no longer looked at Naomi as an unwelcome shadow in his territory. He looked at her the way a man looks at a new and permanent fact. When their paths crossed near the main pantry, he gave a brief, stiff nod, the closest thing to acknowledgement he had ever offered. Junho did not make a speech. He simply began to appear in places he had previously treated as empty space. That afternoon he found Naomi on the balcony where she had always taken her coffee alone. He did not announce himself with the heavy presence he used in the study or the meeting rooms. He stepped onto the stone quietly, 2 cups in his hands, and held one out to her. He accepted it. They stood side by side overlooking the water. For a long time the only sound was the low wind moving through the hills. Junho drank once, then spoke without turning his head. "The men have been different since they started eating your food." Naomi kept her eyes on the sea. "Food does that." "No," he said. "You do that." The words were plain. They did not try to be poetry. That was what made them land. He continued, still watching the horizon. "I built this organization on control. On knowing every corner of every room. I told myself I saw everything that mattered. I was wrong." Naomi felt the weight of the admission settle between them. She did not rush to fill the silence. She had learned over 3 years that silence could be a form of self-protection. Now she was learning it could also be a form of honesty. After a while she said, "Your mother will not like any of this." Junho's jaw shifted slightly. "My mother does not live in this house. She still speaks inside it." He turned to look at her then. The expression on his face was not the cold authority the underworld knew. It was something more complicated, regret edged with a hard, quiet resolve. "She spoke once," he said. "I allowed her words to remain longer than they should have. That ends now." Naomi searched his face for the old distance and found less of it than before. Not gone completely, but reduced. The man who had once answered his mother's cruelty with only "She is my wife. That is enough," was no longer satisfied with enough. Later that evening the back kitchen filled again. This time Junho was present from the beginning. He did not take over. He did not give instructions. He simply leaned against the far counter with a glass of water and watched his wife cook while 7 of his most trusted men moved around her with an ease that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. When the food was ready, Naomi served them as she had before. When she reached for a plate for herself, Junho took it from her hands, portioned the food, and set it down at the small prep table where they had sat the night before. "Eat with us," he said. Not a request directed only at her. A quiet instruction to the room. The men understood. Plates were carried to the same table. Chairs that had never been used for shared meals were pulled into place. For the first time since Naomi had entered the house, the boss, his wife, and the men who protected them sat down together over food she had made. No one discussed business. No one checked phones. They ate. They spoke in low voices about ordinary things. The rain that had returned, a mechanic who had done good work on one of the vehicles, a younger recruit who was finally learning patience. Every so often one of the men would glance at Naomi and use the name that had become natural now. Mama Betty. Each time it was spoken, Junho heard it. Each time, something in his expression tightened with a feeling he did not yet have a full name for. When the meal ended and the men began to clear the plates, Minho paused beside Junho. "She's good for this house," he said simply. Junho looked at his wife, who was covering the remaining collards with the same careful hands that had once cooked only for a private audience of one. "I know," he answered. After the last of the men had gone, the kitchen fell quiet again. Naomi stood at the sink rinsing the final plate. Junho remained at the table watching her. "You don't have to keep cooking at midnight," he said. Naomi shut off the water and turned. "I know. But you still will." It was not a question. She dried her hands and met his eyes. "Yes. Because it's mine. And because they come." Junho stood and walked toward her. He stopped an arm's length away, close enough that the space between them felt intentional rather than accidental. "I'm glad they come," he said. "I'm glad you let them." Naomi felt the last of the old protective distance inside her loosen another degree. She did not step into his arms. He did not need to. The fact that he had stayed, that he had eaten, that he had defended the name the men had given her without ever needing it explained to him, those things were already doing the work. She only nodded once. Outside, the night held steady over the hills. Inside the house that had once treated her as furniture, the black wife of the Korean Mafia Boss was no longer a silent presence in the East Corridor. She was Mama Betty. And the man who had failed to see her for 3 years was finally learning how to look. Chapter 9. The call came on the 3rd morning after Junho first sat at the small prep table and ate his wife's food. Naomi was in the back kitchen, sorting the ingredients Han had brought at dawn, when Junho appeared in the doorway with his phone still in his hand. His expression was controlled, but the tension around his mouth told her enough. "My mother is coming," he said. Naomi set down the bag of rice. She did not ask when. The answer was already in his face. "This afternoon." The old words rose immediately, uninvited and sharp. "She will never be the heart of this house. A black woman can warm a bed. She cannot hold a family." Naomi felt them press against the newer, quieter truths the last few days had begun to build. She straightened her shoulders. "All right." Junho studied her for a moment. "I can tell her not to come." "No," Naomi said. The firmness in her own voice surprised her slightly. "Let her come." He nodded once. Something like respect moved through his eyes before he turned and left to make the necessary arrangements. The household felt the approaching presence the way animals feel a change in pressure before a storm. The staff moved with tighter efficiency. Park's knife struck the cutting board with sharper precision. Even the security men carried a different alertness in their posture. Minho found Naomi near the balcony late that morning and spoke without preamble. "We can be present when she arrives." Naomi understood what he was offering. Visibility. A silent wall of men who had already decided where their respect belonged. "Thank you," she said. "But this part is mine." Minho held her gaze a second longer, then gave a short nod and returned to his duties. She arrived at 20 minutes past 3. Kang Hyejin entered the house the way she had always entered it, as if the walls themselves should adjust to her. Her coat was perfect. Her hair was perfect. Her eyes moved across the foyer with the same cool assessment they had carried on the night Naomi first arrived 3 years earlier. When those eyes landed on her son's black wife, the temperature in the entryway dropped. "Naomi," she said. The name was spoken like a mild inconvenience. "Mother," Junho answered before Naomi could. He stepped forward and placed a brief kiss on his mother's cheek, but his body remained angled in a way that kept Naomi within the frame of his presence. They moved into the formal sitting room. Tea was brought. Polite inquiries about the drive and the weather were exchanged. Through it all, Hygiene's attention kept returning to Naomi with the quiet, cutting focus of a woman who had never accepted the marriage and saw no reason to begin now. After the second cup of tea, she set her saucer down with deliberate care. "I hear strange things," she said, still looking at Naomi. "That the men have given you a name. That you cook for them like a servant." The word servant was shaped to wound. Naomi felt Junho shift beside her, but she spoke first. "They call me Mama Betty," she said. Her voice was steady. "And I cook because I choose to. Not because anyone ordered it." Hygiene's eyebrows lifted a fraction. "How touching. And my son allows this." "I do more than allow it," Junho said. The edge in his voice was quiet but unmistakable. "I sit at the table." His mother turned to him fully then. For a moment the polished surface of her expression cracked enough to show real surprise. "You sit with them? With her? In the staff kitchen?" "Yes." The single word landed between them like a placed stone. Hygiene laughed once, soft and cold. "You always did have a soft heart under all that ice. I warned you. A woman like her can only ever be a temporary comfort. She will never understand this life. She will never hold the respect of the men who matter. She will never be the heart of—" "Stop." Junho's voice was not loud. Did not need to be. His mother fell silent, more from the shock of being interrupted than from obedience. Naomi set her own cup down. Her hands were steady. The old sentence had been about to leave Hygiene's mouth again. The same sentence that had lived under Naomi's skin for 3 years. This time she did not wait for it to finish. "I already heard what you think I will never be," Naomi said. She kept her eyes on the older woman. "You said it the night I arrived. I carried those words longer than I should have. But I am finished carrying them." Hygiene's face tightened. Naomi continued, each word measured and clear. "I am not the heart of this house because you gave me permission. I am not the heart of this house because your son married me. I am the heart of this house because the men who protected decided I was. Because I fed them when they were tired. Because they trust me enough to call me by a name they chose themselves. You can dislike it. You can refuse to understand it. But you do not get to erase it." The sitting room held the silence that followed as if it were something physical. Junho did not look at his mother. He looked at his wife. The expression on his face was not surprise. It was something closer to recognition, as if he were seeing the full shape of the woman who had lived quietly beside him for 3 years and was only now stepping fully into view. Hygiene rose first. She smoothed the front of her coat with precise fingers. Her voice, when it returned, was controlled again, but the cutting confidence had thinned. "I see," she said. "Then there is nothing further for me to say." She looked at her son once more. "You will regret placing so much weight on something so soft." Junho stood as well. "The only thing I regret," he said, "is how long I let your voice speak louder than what was happening in my own house." Hygiene left without another word. The front door closed behind her with a finality that seemed to release a pressure the walls themselves had been holding. For a moment Naomi remained seated, her pulse steady but strong in her throat. Then she felt Junho's hand rest lightly against the back of her shoulder. Not claiming, not performing, simply present. "You didn't have to do that alone," he said. Naomi turned her head and met his eyes. "Yes," she answered. "I did." Outside, afternoon light moved across the black stone floors. Somewhere in the security wing, Minho would already be receiving the quiet report that the boss's mother had left earlier than expected. Somewhere in the back kitchen, the evening's ingredients waited. Naomi rose. The cruel sentence that had once defined her place in this house no longer sat under her ribs like a second pulse. She had spoken the truth of her own position out loud, in the presence of the woman who tried to deny it. And the house had not collapsed. It had simply listened. And for the first time since she arrived, Naomi understood that she no longer needed anyone else's permission to belong. Chapter 10 Foot. The days that followed moved with a different weight. Nothing dramatic announced itself. There were no grand declarations, no sudden transformations of the house's architecture. The change lived instead in the accumulation of small, steady facts that no longer needed to be defended. Naomi cooked when she chose to. Sometimes after midnight. Sometimes in the late afternoon when the light over the sea turned the color of weak tea. The men came when they could. They no longer waited for permission or darkness. They simply appeared, removed their jackets, and took their places around the small prep table or along the counters with the ease of people who had found a place that felt more like refuge than duty. Junho was often among them. He did not attend every meal. The demands of his world still called him away at irregular hours. But when he was in the house, he no longer treated the back kitchen as foreign territory. He entered without ceremony, accepted a plate without performance, and sat among his men while his wife moved between stove and table. The first few times, some of the younger ones still tensed slightly at his presence. That tension faded. Authority remained, but the old wall of separation had thinned. On the sixth evening after Hygiene's visit, the kitchen held a quieter group than usual. Only Miniseo Han and Seo Jun remained after the others had returned to their posts. The meal had been simple. Rice, stewed chicken, greens cooked low and slow with smoked meat. Conversation had drifted into comfortable silence. Minu finished first and leaned back in his chair. "Boss," he said, "the younger ones keep asking when Mama Betty is cooking next. They're starting to plan their shifts around it." Junho glanced across the table at Naomi. A faint, private amusement moved through his eyes. "Then let them plan," he said. Han smiled into his plate. Seojun gave a short, approving sound. The moment was ordinary. That was what made it valuable. Later, after the three men had gone and the last of the dishes had been cleaned, Naomi and Junho remained. She was wiping down the counter. He stood near the window that overlooked the dark slope of the hills. The house around them felt settled, as if it had finally adjusted to a new center. "You were right," Junho said after a while. Naomi looked up. "About what?" "That you never needed grand gestures." He turned from the window. "I spent years thinking the only way to protect someone in this life was to keep them separate from it. I didn't understand that separation can become another kind of erasure." Naomi set the cloth aside. She leaned her hip against the counter and studied him. The man in front of her still carried the same controlled presence the underworld respected. But something in the way he stood in this particular room had changed. He no longer looked like a visitor. "I waited a long time to be seen," she said. "Longer than I admitted to myself. I understand." He crossed the kitchen slowly and stopped in front of her. This time the space between them was smaller than it had been on the night he first tasted her food. He did not reach for her immediately. He simply looked at her face as if still cataloging details he had previously overlooked. The steady calm of her eyes, the faint scar near her left eyebrow from a childhood fall, the way she held her shoulders when she was telling the truth. "I can't undo the 3 years," he said. "But I can stop adding to them." Naomi felt the words settle where the old cruel sentence used to live. The replacement was not loud. Did not need to be. "I'm not asking you to undo anything," she answered. "I'm only asking you to stay present for what comes next." Junho lifted one hand and rested it lightly against the side of her neck, his thumb just under the curve of her jaw. The touch was careful, almost testing. When she did not pull away, his hand remained. "I will," he said. They stood like that for a long moment, the quiet of the kitchen holding them without pressure. Outside, a security radio crackled once in the distance and then went still. The house continued its low mechanical breathing. Somewhere above them, the rooms that had once felt so empty no longer pressed down with the same weight. Naomi reached up and covered his hand with her own. "The men still call me Mama Betty," she said softly. "I understand. Does it bother you?" Junho's thumb moved once, a small stroke against her skin. "No," he said. "It tells me they see what I was too slow to see. That you are not temporary. That you belong here." Naomi held his gaze. "And you?" she asked. "What do you see now?" He took a single breath before answering. "I see the woman who turned a kitchen no one cared about into the only room in this house that feels alive. I see the woman my men trust enough to name. I see my wife." He paused and the next words came quieter. "I see you." The simplicity of it reached her more deeply than any larger declaration could have. Naomi nodded once. She did not speak. Some truths did not require immediate reply. They only required being received. Junho lowered his hand, but he did not step away. Instead he glanced toward the stove, then back at her. "Will you cook tomorrow?" he asked. "Yes. Then I'll be here." The promise was plain. It did not come wrapped in dramatic language. It simply existed, solid as the black stone floors beneath their feet. Naomi turned off the under-cabinet light. Together they left the kitchen and walked the east corridor side by side. For the first time since she had entered this house, the long hallway did not feel like a place she passed through alone. It felt like a path that now led somewhere shared. Behind them, the back kitchen cooled in darkness. But the warmth that had been built there over chicken and collards and quiet respect remained, steady and real, in the space between the Korean Mafia boss and the black woman his men had named Mama Betty. Chapter 11. Winter arrived quietly over the hills outside Busan. One morning the sea below the house was the color of steel, and the wind that moved across the balcony carried the first real bite of the season. Naomi stood at the railing with a cup of coffee and watched the water the way she had every morning for more than 3 years. The difference was that she no longer stood there as a woman practicing invisibility. Behind her the glass door slid open. Junho stepped out carrying his own cup. He handed it to her without a word and took hers in exchange so she could warm both hands around the fresh one. The gesture had become ordinary. That was what made it matter. They stood together in the cold air, shoulders almost touching. "The men asked if you're cooking tonight," he said. Naomi smiled faintly into the steam. "I already told Minu yes." "I know. He still asked me." Like he needed the confirmation. "They're protective." "They are." Junho drank from her cup, the one that now carried the faint trace of her lipstick on the rim. "Of you more than of me these days." She glanced sideways at him. "Does that trouble you?" "No," he met her eyes. "It tells me the house finally has its priorities in the right order." The wind moved between them. Below, a security vehicle traced its slow path along the lower driveway and disappeared into the trees. Everything looked the same as it had on the many mornings she had stood here alone. Everything felt different. That evening the back kitchen held more people than usual. Word had moved quietly through the rotations that Mama Betty was cooking a full meal, the kind that took most of the afternoon and filled the entire wing with the deep, layered smell of stewed meat, seasoned greens, cornbread cooling on the rack, and a peach cobbler that had become a quiet legend among the night shift. Men arrived as their duties allowed. Some ate standing. Some waited for a chair. All of them greeted her the same way now, with the name that had settled into the walls of the house like it had always belonged there. Junho came in near the end of the service. He did not need to announce himself. The room adjusted around him the way it always had, but the adjustment no longer created distance between him and the woman at the stove. He accepted a plate from her hands, touched her waist briefly as he passed, and took his place at the prep table among his men. No one stared. No one commented. The boss eating his wife's food in the back kitchen had become part of the natural order of the house. Later, after the last plate had been cleaned and the last man had returned to his post, Naomi and Junho remained behind. The under-cabinet light was the only illumination left. The air still carried the warm sweetness of the cobbler. Naomi leaned against the counter, arms loosely folded. Junho stood across from her, close enough that the space between them felt intentional and calm. "Do you remember what your mother said the night I arrived?" she asked. His expression did not close. He simply nodded once. "She said I would never be the heart of this house. That a black woman could warm a bed but could not hold a family." Junho's jaw tightened slightly at the memory, but he did not interrupt. Naomi looked around the kitchen, at the skillet that had fed so many, at the small table where the most dangerous men in her husband's organization had learned to sit and wait their turn, at the doorway through which she had once moved like a ghost. "I believed her for a long time," she said. "I organized my whole life in this house around those words. I stayed quiet. I stayed small. I cooked in secret like I was doing something wrong." She drew a slow breath. "I don't believe her anymore." Junho watched her in silence. Naomi continued, her voice steady and clear. "This kitchen is mine. These men chose to call me Mama Betty without asking anyone's permission. You sit at this table now. The house that was supposed to keep me at the edges has made room for me at the center. I am not a temporary comfort. I am not just the woman who warms your bed. I am the heart of this house, not because anyone gave me the title but because I took the space and filled it. The words settled into the quiet room with the weight of something final. Junho crossed the small distance between them. He lifted both hands and framed her face, his thumbs resting gently along her cheekbones. For a long moment he only looked at her, as if committing the full truth of her to memory. "You are," he said simply. "You have been for longer than I was willing to see. I won't make that mistake again." Naomi reached up and covered his hands with hers. Outside, the winter wind moved across the black stone and glass of the house. Inside, the back kitchen held the lingering heat of the meal and the quieter heat of two people who had finally stopped missing each other in the same rooms. Junho leaned forward and rested his forehead against hers. "Welcome home, Mama Betty," he said. Naomi closed her eyes. For the first time since she had walked through the front door 3 years earlier, the words felt true. Outro. If you stayed with Naomi all the way to the end, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not invisible in your own life. You are not too much or not enough. And you are not too late to be seen. Sometimes the people who were supposed to notice you simply didn't. That does not mean you were never worthy of being noticed. Like Naomi, you can still take up space. You can still cook the food. You can still become the heart of your own house, even if it takes time and quiet courage and a few people who finally taste what you've been offering all along. If this story touched you, tell me in the comments. Are you Team Mama Betty? Or did you feel for Junho learning how to see? And if you want more stories like this, slow, emotional, full of quiet power and the kind of love that arrives late but arrives true, make sure you are subscribed and have the notification bell on. I post new stories every week. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. You are seen. You are becoming. I'll meet you in the next one.